A Problem of Four by Imagination Junkyard. Chapter 2. Frantic. Red woke up. It had been a long time since he'd gotten to do that. By the time something happened that drew Red apart from Four as a whole, Four was long awake, and peeling away from the other colors wasn't quite the same as actually waking up, since he always had awareness as long as Four had awareness. He was, after all, still Four. But here he was, waking up, fully aware and fully himself. There was no sensation of slowly growing an opinion solidly his own, rather than mixed and diluted with everyone else's. Just wakefulness. It was a little exciting, if he was being honest. He blinked at the sky, then turned his head both ways to check for the others. No purple tunic, no blue that wasn't wind-draped halfway across sky, both sound asleep, or wild sleeping sitting up at the smoking remains of a fire, knees pulled to his chest. No green that wasn't twilight high roller sky. He sat up with a frown. Where did the others go? Had they planned this without him somehow? I thought we were still keeping this a secret. When he shifted to get to his feet, a flash of familiar violet had his gaze dropping to his tunic. His tunic of 4 different colors stitched together. The quietness of only having his own thoughts was suddenly too quiet. Well, that's not right, he thought, and that was the only moment of mild bemusement before sudden panic set in. That's really not right. How could it be him, all alone, in a tunic that belonged to the 4 of them together? If it were just him here, he should have been wearing red and only red. Where were the others? Were they dead? Did they break like the sword did? A tiny squeak sounded from his throat as hot tears spilled onto his cheeks. Quickly, he pressed his hands over his mouth to try and stifle the tiny sob that forced its way out. How was he going to explain this to everyone? Should he explain anything to anyone, or just pretend he was all 4? Where had his brothers, his other parts, gone? He sucked in a breath meant to calm him, but it released with a whine, and he glanced around, hoping the sound had gone unnoticed. It hadn't. Time, the only other person awake, had been sitting at the edge of camp, but was now turning towards him. Their eyes met, and Time quickly glanced around the area, probably hoping Twilight would miraculously appear to take care of the matter. The rancher was always awake before the sun had even quite started rising, and always left camp to patrol or do sword drills, or whatever it was he did as soon as the second early riser, Time, was awake. Which meant Time was the only one who could do anything about this until warriors, who, like the other 2, also had an early morning rising drilled into him by his lifestyle, woke up. Red looked away and tried to suck his tears back in and look normal so the man wouldn't feel obligated to come over and check on him. He knew Time wasn't the best with emotional type stuff, and knowing the old man would come over to try and help him, especially since Red didn't even know what could help, made him feel guilty. It didn't work, and he let out another stuttering whimper, more tears rolling down his face. Don't come over, please don't come over. I don't know what to say to you. I don't know what to do. Footsteps approached. 4, are you all right? What's wrong? Red sniffed, the panic growing. What was he supposed to say? He'd never been good at coming up with excuses on the fly. That was more Vio and Green's thing. Did you have a nightmare? Time asked gently. Yes, Red quickly said, then shrank sheepishly, wiping at his wet eyes. Yes. Must have been a pretty bad one. Time slowly lowered himself to sit by Red's side. His hand rose, hovering over his back uncertainly. Red could see the lift of his arm from his watery peripheral vision and wished desperately he'd follow through. Instead, Time let his hand fall into the grass. More tears welled up in Red's eyes. Do you want to talk about it? Time asked awkwardly. Oh, he wanted to talk about it all right. Not the non-existent nightmare, but the fact he'd just woken up to his brothers missing, his other colors, the other parts of himself, very important people for many, many reasons, just gone. That actually was a bit of a nightmare, come to think of it. Still, he shook his head, wiping at his eyes again, even as more tears replaced the old ones. The others hadn't ever agreed to share yet. It wouldn't be right for him to go behind their backs and do so. There was an awkward silence that settled heavy in Red's chest, burning into his stomach with a discomfort he yearned to unknot. Sometimes going for a walk helps me, Time finally said. That wasn't a bad idea. At the very least, it would get him away from camp, away from the others, where he could cry in peace without bothering anyone. Nodding slowly, he got to his feet, wiping his face on his sleeve. "Do you want me to come with you?" Time asked in a voice that silently hoped the answer would be no. "No." "All right. If you ever want to talk about your nightmares, or whatever else, I'm here." "Thanks," Red warbled. He grabbed his sword, just in case. Right, they needed to fix that. Or he needed to fix it? Was fixing it a good idea without the others? And started walking. He headed away from camp, letting his feet lead him as he wandered, each breath a hiccup. After a long while, he timidly called out, "Guys?" Silence was the only reply. He had expected as much, but even still he called out, "Green? Vio? Blue?" A sudden rustle of leaves and feathers had him jumping with a squeak. A bird shot past him, the flapping of wings echoing in his ears instead of the 3 voices he desperately wanted to hear. His lip trembled. "Please?" When there was no reply, Red sank to the ground. He wished his brothers were here. Even just one of them would be reassuring. Vio would probably know what to do. He was smart like that. And Green would be able to calm him down. He was always so good at calming him down. He'd even take Blue calling him a crybaby at this point. He just wanted someone. Blue blinked at the greenery before him, then sniffed as the sensation of a runny nose caught his attention. When sniffing didn't do enough, he swiped his sleeve across his nose, then touched his face. Ew, why are we all snotty and teary? His face screwed up in confusion. And why are we in the middle of the woods? When there was no response, he glanced around, tucking blonde strands behind his ear. Guys, where are we?" Still no response. Standing, Blue huffed. "Seriously, is this some kind of lame prank? What, did you guys knock me over the head, ditch me in the woods?" There was no response. Sure, he had been a little harsh last night, but their head had been killing him, and he felt like he was nearly about to rip open their skull and climb out of it. How could he not have been cranky? He didn't think what he'd said was worth this kind of response. Not to mention he thought they'd agreed not to split as long as the sword was cracked. He chewed on the idea of an apology for a long moment before heaving a sigh. "Okay, I'm sorry I was a jerk last night. Happy?" The lack of response had his jaw clenching in frustration. "Seriously? What, want me to kneel or something? Not happening." Picking a random direction, he started walking. The sound of nature, usually tranquil, felt oppressive. Each step without the sight or sound of one of the others felt like a weight pressing heavier and heavier onto his back. "Guys, this isn't funny," he growled, coming to a stomping halt and crossing his arms. It was unnerving, actually, even as he ignored that little pit in his stomach. Vio wouldn't care if it unsettled him, and Green might have even been the one to come up with the idea, but Red? As much as Blue picked on Red, soft-hearted chicken that he was, Red was exactly that, soft-hearted. "Red, don't you think it's kind of mean to let this go on for so long? I mean, put yourself in my shoes. How would you like to be abandoned in the woods like this?" He expected to see his other quarters sheepishly duck through the leaves, looking all sorry and pathetic about it, apologizing and making excuses for going along with it, even though the menace had probably been perfectly on board when the plan had originally been made. Brat. But there was nothing. He breathed in past the knot growing inside of him and turned the anxiety into something more productive. "Fine," he spat. "Have it your way. Don't come crying to me when I get all terribly lost and break an ankle and die out here. Don't even come to my funeral, cowards." There was a loud snap behind him, and he drew his sword on instinct, spinning around just in time to see the white tail of a deer bobbing away. His fingers tightened on the sword as he huffed out a breath, then stilled, eyes widening. Wait a minute, the sword is... The gemstone set into the pommel was black, not blue. The blade slipped from his fingers, and he grabbed for his tunic, holding it out and staring at it, eyes widening further. What the... Green found himself staring down at Forrest's tunic. His tunic, but not his tunic. It took a moment for him to realize why, exactly, there was something so odd about that. There were no other voices in his brain, and he definitely didn't remember splitting. The last part made sense, since their tunic was still multicolored. But the first part didn't make sense because their tunic was still multicolored. If he felt things this strongly, the others should have as well, but he couldn't sense them. His gaze drifted to the foresword lying at his feet, unsheathed. Carefully, he picked it up and felt for the sheath on his back. Why had that been lying out? where was he, and why had picking up the sword felt like his action alone? He only felt this in control and alone in his head when split, but his tunic wasn't split, and the gem on the sword was black, and... Is this because of the crack on the sword? Okay, don't freak out. You can fix this. You just need to fix the sword. Green glanced around. But why am I not at camp? How did I get all the way wherever this is? Spinning in a slow circle, he looked for anything familiar. Nothing at all. He wouldn't be able to fix the sword without proper tools. And those were all back at camp. So where was camp? Think, he muttered. What would Vio do? He straightened his spine and settled his face into a calmer expression. It's simple, Green, he told himself. You just... He trailed off and scrubbed at his hair. I don't know what I'm not Vio. Finally, he lifted his head. I know, I'll climb a tree. That's what Wild always does when he tries to figure out where we are. Scanning the area, he picked a tall tree with some lower limbs and dug his fingers into the curves of the bark, boots slipping against the wood as he tried to find enough purchase to push himself towards the lowest branch. Curse being short. One of his hands shot out towards the limb, brushing against it but failing to grab hold. He scrabbled against the trunk and lunged for the branch again, this time hoisting himself up. Red almost fell, his reflexes barely managing to fling his arms around the tree in time, hugging it in fright. Why was he in a tree? He'd been on the ground a second ago. Where even was this? There had been a little log with a pretty flower next to it in the clearing where he'd been before, but this was all trees. How had he gotten turned around? Why didn't he remember how he'd gotten here? Panic filled him as he hugged the tree tighter. How was he going to get back to camp if he didn't know where he... Green slowly loosened his arms from the trunk. He didn't remember doing that. Though he did need to do that to climb higher, come to think of it. Maybe he'd been on autopilot. Standing carefully on the branch, he worked his way up to the next one. The branch after that was too far, and no matter how he tried, he couldn't climb any higher. Green spared a glance down instead. Yeesh, this is pretty far from the ground. On slightly trembling legs, he stood tall on the branch, gut wobbling with every shift of the limb beneath him, and the only thing he saw was the same color he was nicknamed for. Climbed up here for nothing, he muttered. Well, back down I go. Carefully, he began to work his way back towards the ground. Vio's fingers slipped from something before he even had a chance to register what was happening, falling a couple feet and hitting the ground with an oof. Lips curled into a grimace, he sat up, rubbing his back. What an unpleasant way to come to. Made even more unpleasant by the fact that he was in the middle of the woods with no memory of how he'd gotten there. The last thing he remembered was going to bed with the others, and now it was just him. Quickly, he took stock of himself to make sure there weren't any important injuries he should be concerned about. Other than a probable bruising back, he seemed fine. At least as far as injuries went. There were definitely some pressing matters that brought him a level of mild concern. The multicolored tunic for one, and the black gem of the foresword, once he took a look at it to see if the tunic matched the state of the sword. It did, though that certainly did not match the state of Four's mind, that is, only Vio being there. Calling upon the power of the foresword, he pulled it to see if the others would appear. They did not. I should definitely get this fixed as soon as possible, he thought to himself. It's my best bet. Though there was the matter of his being rather lost, with no sense of where camp was, since he didn't know what direction he'd traveled away from camp in the first place. So he sat down against the tree he had fallen from and decided to wait. If the others realized he was missing, they'd eventually come looking for him. Wandering aimlessly through the forest would do him no good, since he might just get further away from camp, or walk right past the others. Wolfie has a good nose anyway. He'll probably be able to track me down. It'll be easier for him if I stay put. In the meantime, he considered how this situation might have happened. How had he, with no memory, fallen from a tree and wound up here? If I found myself like this, he mused quietly, I suppose there's a chance the others have been here too. Perhaps they're not entirely gone. It would explain how he'd gotten here, and been in the middle of climbing up or down, he wasn't entirely sure. A tree. Someone else could have knocked him out and dropped him in the middle of the woods, but no one could have made him climb a tree unconscious. Someone else had to have been climbing it, and that being one of the other colors was the only thing he could think of that made any sense. He doubted the others would have come to that conclusion if they got in any time in their body. Of course, he wasn't entirely sure his hypothesis was correct, but there was a rather easy fix for that. He'd simply write out a note. That way, should he suddenly vanish and get replaced with another color, they would be able to write a note back. They would even be able to communicate with each other, even if they couldn't exist at the same time. He reached into their bag and... Baloo stared at what there should have been a multicolored tunic in his vision, in his hands. There had been a moment ago, but now he was reaching into his bag while sitting against a tree. Was he being mind-controlled or something? Possessed? Were the other colors doing things too, or was he just losing his mind? Letting out a frustrated sound, he got back to his feet, wincing at the soreness of his back. What had caused that? Screw this, screw it all. I'll find my way back to camp and fix that stupid sword, and then whatever stupid thing is happening will be done, he said decisively, picking a direction and marching off. And if that doesn't bring them back, that's... His fists clenched, unable to spit out the word fine, even with no one around him to hear. The others drove him crazy sometimes, but this was decidedly worse. But he wasn't going to think about that. No matter what had happened in the past, they'd wound up together and okay. It would surely be like that again. He wasn't sure how long he'd been shoving through branches and ferns when he heard a growl and a snort behind him, a familiar one. It sounded like Wolfie had come to retrieve him. "If you think I'm lost, you're wrong," he said without turning around. "I know where I'm going." Wolfie circled him, gently grabbing the edge of his tunic in his teeth to tug him the other direction. Face heating, Blue pushed him away. "I know that's where camp is. I was just going for a walk. I was going to head that way later." Wolfie didn't seem to believe him, based on the way his ears flicked back as he circled Blue again, pressing his nose into his back to nudge him in the right direction. "Leave me alone," Blue growled. "You don't have to prod me like..." Red jumped as something nudged at his back and spun around. Not only was he not in a tree anymore, but Wolfie was there. He tried not to think too hard about how that made no sense, and instead focused on his relief of having been found. "Wolfie!" he cried in delight, flinging his arms around the wolf, who let out a confused yelp. "Oh, I'm so glad you found me. Things have been so weird." He cut off as he realized he had very little way of explaining without giving away their secret. Pulling away from the hug, he cleared his throat. I got turned around and, wasn't sure which way camp was, so I'm really glad you found me." Wolfie stared at him. He wasn't sure how a wolf could look so incredulous, but the rancher sure managed it. Knitting his fingers together, Red forced an awkward smile and said, "So, lead the way." The wolf began to walk, then stopped and lowered to the ground. Red gasped in delight. "I get to ride?" With an excited pump of his fists, he climbed aboard and gently knitted his fingers into the thick fur as Wolfie rose and started moving again. It was a relief to be off his feet. He was tired, and his back ached for some reason. "Maybe I should try to fix the sword," he thought as he idly stroked Wolfie's thick coat with one hand and kept the other secured in his fur. "But what if it locks the others away somehow? It makes this permanent? I don't want this to be permanent." He bit his lip, determined not to cry. He couldn't keep crying about the matter. It wouldn't solve anything. He had to be more like Vio, keep a level head and figure out his next steps. He pondered the entire way back, squeaking in surprise as Twilight transformed before they reached camp, swinging him off his shoulders and back onto the ground. "Are you okay, Four?" Red looked up at the rancher, wondering if time had told him about his nightmare. "I've just had a weird morning," he said softly, gripping the hem of his tunic. Twilight studied him. "If something's wrong, you can tell me." The smith's eyes darted away, unable to look Twilight in the eyes when the man was being so sincere. Not when he couldn't be fully open with him. It wasn't fair. Everyone was being so nice, and all he was doing was keeping secrets and making them worried. But he didn't want the others to be mad at him for spilling their secret without permission either, so... "I know," he murmured. I'll tell you as soon as if I ever can." Maybe that hadn't been the best thing to say, based on the way the rancher studied him in concern. "But nothing's wrong right now." "That I can't handle," he added silently to make it feel like less of a lie. Because he could handle it. He bet the other colors wouldn't think otherwise, but that wasn't true. Unless the others at camp to help with fixing the sword, he decided, because mulling it over the entire walk back, he couldn't think of any other solutions. But when he entered the clearing and saw Wild cooking for everyone, he faltered. "Well, I can't interrupt breakfast. They need a chance to eat first. I'll ask afterwards. Found him, Twilight declared with a grin, ruffling the smith's hair. Red smiled softly at the affectionate action, and Twilight pulled away, his smile suddenly looking a little perplexed. Sorry if I worried you guys, Red said. I just got turned around. Back just in time for breakfast, Wild remarked, glancing up from where he'd been finishing up. Four clapped his hands a little and let out a small, "Good!" though his clapping immediately came to a stop as he realized he was getting odd looks. Right, act like Four. It was hard to act like Four when he only felt like a quarter of himself. So he ate breakfast quietly. Maybe the less he spoke, the better. He didn't want to say something he'd regret later once he was whole. If he was right about the issue boiling down to the sword, he'd only have to deal with this for a little longer. After breakfast, they'd fix the sword, and then he'd, hopefully, be all back together. As breakfast finished, he took a breath and opened his mouth to ask for help from the others. They'd need, at minimum, a fire rod, an ice rod, and a hammer. Maybe he could recruit the same group as before to help out. But before he could get a word out, there was a shout. "Everyone pack up quickly! Portal!" Ah, snap, he thought as he hurried over to gather his things. Chapter notes. Today was all about Four. That is to say, I drew him in goofy leggings over on my Tumblr and then headed over here to upload this chapter. If everything goes according to plan, this fic will be 4 chapters long. We'll see if that works out. Hydrate, stretch, get sleep if it's late, eat, take your meds, shower, whatever it is you might be neglecting that your body needs, okay? This is end of chapter 2.